15th edition of the Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol, Banega Swasth India. And we are at the Bank of Baroda Mughal tent. We're delighted to introduce Minding the Mind, Mining the Mind. This session is presented by Rajasthan Patrika. In addition to an illustrious career as a writer, television producer, documentary filmmaker, Rajiv Mehrotra has been a personal student of His Holiness the Dalai Lama for 4 decades and manages as Secretary and Trustee the Foundation for Universal Responsibility established with the Nobel Peace Prize. A remarkable and a multifaceted figure of our times, Mehrotra speaks frequently on His Holiness, Buddhism, interfaith harmony, and issues pertaining to media. He has authored and edited several acclaimed books, including The Mind of the Guru, Conversations with the Spiritual Masters, Understanding the Dalai Lama, The Open Frame Reader, Unreeling the Documentary Film, and Conversations with the Dalai Lama on Life, Living, and Happiness. As an independent documentary filmmaker, commissioning editor, and producer, Mehrotra has won 32 national awards from the President of India. In the spirit of In Conversation, the iconic talk show, of which he was the host for decades, Mehrotra discusses his myriad pursuits with writer Devapriya Roy. Devapriya is the author of 3 best-selling novels, The Vague Woman's Handbook, The Weight Loss Club, and The Friends from College. In 2015, she published The Heat and Dust Project, co-written by Saurabh Jha, which debuted at #1 on the Hindustan Times AC Nielsen list. Roy published Indira in 2018, a unique graphic biography of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi in collaboration with Priya Kurian. She's currently translating Tagore's Gora into English. Both of them will be signing their books after the session. Grab your copies from the bookshop and they'll be here.
Hello. Good afternoon. Welcome to this, what I hope is going to be a very illuminating session.
Good God. There's plenty of light all around us, so that should take care of it.
Yeah, well, but I'm delighted to do this, and we have an intimate audience, which is wonderful. So we'll open it up for questions also soon, so that, we're all in it together. So, I'm going to begin with a confession. Whenever I open a book, I read the dedication first. I have a thing for dedications, okay? And I'm going to read out the dedication of this one. Okay, he's written so many books, as you know, The Mind of the Guru. And with your liberty, I will read it out.
Do I have a choice?
No. So this book is dedicated to my teachers, Rajiv writes, my root guru, His Holiness Dalai Lama, BKS Iyengar, the late Swami Ranganathananda, the memory of my parents, Har Narayan and Shanti Mehrotra and Sharda Gopinath, and to my wife, best friend and fellow traveler, Meenakshi Gopinath. This seemed to me to be, the map that a young spiritual seeker followed.
Absolutely.
Will you tell us a little bit about this? Because we've got, and also if you'll explain what root guru means.
Sorry, what means?
What root guru means.
Oh, okay. I started my sort of quest, in a sense, holding my dad's little finger. When growing up, we used to go to lectures, and you will know, at Gold Park in Calcutta, at the Ramakrishna Mission. And things sort of fell apart. I went to study in England in the mid-70s when the subculture of the time was at its peak.
Right.
I was at Oxford. I wasn't very good at academics. And so I plunged in at the deep end of life in the theatre and all that went with it. And none of which will I answer any questions about. And so the day, the last day of term, when I, after my sort of final year, I rushed back home, confused and in quite a mess. And I ended up in at the Ramakrishna Mission in Delhi. And
so this is the one in Paharganj, is it?
That's right. That's right. At the Ramakrishna Mission, and there was a very kindly Swamiji there then called Swami Bodhananda. And Swami Bodhananda ji said, look, I don't know what to say to you. Your mind is so fragmented and frazzled that all I can suggest is that you listen to music. And of course, at that time, we were listening to a different kind of music for those who are, aware of the music of that time, which is probably be a greater aggravator to a frazzled state of mind. Anyway, be that as it may, the initial journey continued with the Ramakrishna Mission, and I went to Swami Ranganathananda Ji Maharaj, as we described him in
so
Calcutta.
So was Swami Ji at that time the head of the
Swami Bodhananda was the head of the Ramakrishna Mission in Delhi, and Swami Ranganathananda was in Hyderabad, and who I had grown up with. So when I was calm enough to travel to Hyderabad, I went in to see him, and I received in the terms of the mission what they call Diksha, which is a kind of minor initiation where you're given a sacred word and some guidelines by the master. Over the years, with my practice and working with Swami Ranganathananda Ji Maharaj, not widely known for those of you who are familiar with the Ramakrishna Mission, and we call him in Calcutta Thakur, and Thakur's writings and philosophy. Thakur was basically a bhakta, a devotee who followed the traditions of devotion. But Vivekananda, who's his primary disciple, often said that Ramakrishna was my master and the Buddha was my Ishta. And Ishta is like the core deity or figure that you worship and learn from. And Swami Ranganathananda was a Jnana Yogi, and that's where sort of it merges into Buddhism in some ways. And so we used to talk a lot about the Buddha, and he said that, like with Swamiji, and I'm not quite, equipped to take you the entire journey. I think your path is with Buddhism. And it was truly remarkable and a great testimony to India's inclusiveness. And I think the Ramakrishna Mission, like His Holiness, is a wonderful example of that. And so I wrote off a letter to the Dalai Lama saying I wanted to see him.
And which year are we in now?
And we are now in about 78.
78.
And so I heard back from him or from his office to say, I'd like to see you. And somehow it didn't work out, and nor was my life working out. So I went off to Columbia to study film.
To study film, yeah.
And so I had an interesting sort of journey. I did science in school, English literature at St. Stephen's, and economics and politics at Oxford, and film at Columbia.
And it's wonderful precisely because you did all these different things, that the books have come out in the way they have. They answer so many of our questions from this time,
So I came back to India, and there's three friends of mine, and there's who were, and one of them is an IAS officer posted in as a district magistrate in Kalpa. And since Punita is here, she will probably know him, Vivek Srivastav and Radhika Singh and Sanjay Acharya. Three friends of mine were in Kalpa. And, Kalpa is in Himachal, bordering Ladakh. And so His Holiness was traveling through the longer route to Ladakh and stopped by in Kalpa and with his entourage and walked into the room. And he looks at these three gentlemen and said, "Oh, do you know Rajiv?" And so they said, "Of course, yes." And I had this frantic trunk call to say, the great man is asking after you. Where are you? And so I met him, and that started the journey with Buddhism. But I do want to flag what was truly remarkable and significant and very gratifying for me was that Swami Ranganathananda and His Holiness became very good friends. And so His Holiness visited Belur, Swamiji went to Dharamsala. I had the great privilege of moderating a discussion between them. And so His Holiness became my sort of root guru. And a root guru really is someone who is your primary source of teaching and inspiration. And particularly when you are part of a tradition that encourages you to learn from all traditions. Right. So it's sort of like, you come back home each time.
Right.
And to a teacher like His Holiness, who will say, and it's a byline we carry in a program, multi-faith program we are learning, we are sort of hosting, where he says that we must learn and respect all religions and traditions while respecting our own. And so that's where the concept of root guru, certainly in our tradition, comes up. And also that you can go to other lamas and learn from them. Mm. And when I'm talking too much, just stop me.
I'm fascinated.
Because, for example, His Holiness is 86 now, but when he was still, in his early 80s, he would still receive oral instructions and teachings from lamas younger than himself. So that tradition of learning would continue, absolutely, but you would still have your root guru.
Right. So that brings me to Thakur, his biography of Sri Ramakrishna. And being a Calcutta girl myself, of course, I used to go to the Gold Park Ramakrishna Mission Library. And, the synchronicity of these things, my current obsession is translating Gora, which is set in Calcutta at exactly that time. And the debates in its pages are all about, the Brahmos and the Sanatanis at the time. And of course, a lot of reform was happening and so on. It was the time when Sri Ramakrishna emerged. And in his extraordinary sort of way, and you have captured it so brilliantly, because this book also speaks to our generation, to a rational mind, even though you give us the frame of reference to understand him, but that frame of reference is not, it cannot be scientifically quantified, right? So will you talk a little bit about, about Thakur and how you see him?
Well, Thakur sort of in a very sort of gradual manner burst upon the firmament, and sort of encouraged and supported very eloquently by Swami Vivekananda, though he takes Thakur's teachings in a somewhat different direction, with an emphasis on the Vedanta, basically on the Vedanta, and the service follows from that. My passion for Ramakrishna was really born as a seeker, as a student, and I always felt that the great strength of India's civilizational heritage was the juxtaposition of wisdom with method.
Right.
And so, at some places, Swamiji talks about it, and certainly it's inherent in Buddhism, that we go through knowledge or intellectual understanding. First knowledge, then understanding, wisdom, and then finally realization, when it begins to impact our deepest reflexive responses. And it is only when it impacts our deepest reflexive responses that it becomes real and transforming. So you can listen to an eloquent speaker, be very impressed by the ideas and think about them, and yet not be transformed.
Right.
So the genius...
And your own reflexes, oh my God.
And so the genius of Thakur was twofold, or manyfold. And that was really that he was amongst the first teachers, I think, in history, as far as I can tell, to some degree the Buddha, but we never really knew what the Buddha's enlightenment experience was. We knew the method that he followed till he sat under the Bodhi tree.
Right.
But Thakur consciously chose to engage in the sadhanas, the methods of the different traditions of Hinduism itself.
Right.
Dvaita, Tantra, etc.
Right.
And then he didn't stop there. And this is where the great sort of celebration of Thakur really happens, that he stepped out of the temple precincts and created a little kutir, a cottage, where he engaged in the practices of Islam.
Of Islam
and Christianity.
And Christianity.
And in full public view. So when someone of that position does something in public, it is a very conscious choice and a message that he is sending out at a particular time in history, which, by Jove, is so valid and relevant today. And that is what, just to connect with His Holiness. And so the Dalai Lama will also today say that each one of us has a different mental disposition. And so we need a different mental diet. And if you just begin to look at the idea of a mental diet as a physical diet, the parallels are so easy to understand. You know, if you're born in a particular context, particular climate, particular culture, you will like chilies or fish, or you will be a vegetarian or what have you. So similarly, your minds need a different mental diet.
Right.
And so for me, that was what drew me to Thakur. And I found that this is all from secondary sources, obviously, but none of the great biographies, and there are some great biographies, Christopher Isherwood and has done Max Miller, but none of them had really sought to document or write about the method.
The method, absolutely. And the other thing that was, that I had heard about, because when you grow up in Bengal, you hear these stories, but you've also, with all the secondary research and all, established it. That one of his teachers, the one who instructed him in method, was Bhairavi, was a
woman, and in Tantra.
And Tantra. Absolutely.
And in full public view.
And so there's the other thing which really spoke to me was something that you've recorded here, that Vivekananda bore a sort of testimony to his guru's mind. And because he himself came from a rationalist position, he would argue, that his witness is very, very important today also, right? So do you want to talk a little bit about these two sort of, Thakur and Swamiji and Nivedita?
Well, I haven't researched and studied a great deal about Nivedita, I have to confess. And so she doesn't figure prominently in the book, but certainly Swamiji, yes. And I think that when we talk about wisdom, experience, and realization, so here was the Jnani who had surrendered to a bhakta and who was looking for experience, for realization. And so he so desperately reaches out to Thakur and says, I want the experience.
So do you want to just sort of tell our audience the difference? Okay. So, when I was a child, you remember those old history books, and there would be a chapter on the Buddha, and there would be this line, and then under the Bodhi tree, he received enlightenment. And I remember asking everybody, but what happened? Nobody could tell me that, right? What happens?
Well, nobody can tell you that. That's the whole point of it. And hence, when we say nobody can tell you that, I heard in the previous speaker talking a little bit about use of poetry and music and the non-conceptual experience. So what our traditions really teach us, and hence I keep underlying method, is that, let me tell you my story, related to His Holiness on this aspect of what happens. So it's been 40 years since I've been studying with His Holiness. And the timelines are not exact, but something like 5 years, 7 years into practice. And I'm not a very regular practitioner, but, I struggle and I engage and I fail and I carry on. And I used to say to His Holiness, but nothing is happening. It's been 5 years. Or I'd go in and report that, I had this experience of expansiveness, or, my third eye was throbbing, or where the third eye is supposed to be. And he would just completely ignore what I was saying. But I was very sort of persistent on this because I needed, like most people, the assurance that my journey and unfolding on the path was yielding results. Because we're all trained to be looking for outcomes. that we can tangibly and
Right.
consciously identify. And so at, one very sort of difficult morning, I pushed. He said, you will never know when something is happening, because if you know, your evolution and growth will stop. Because it will stop at where you think and when you think that you have had insight, wisdom, or a transforming experience, or however you choose to describe it. So great masters and great teachers, will never seek to define what is happening, because it is a non-conceptual experience. And when pushed to explain this, I often say, look, I cannot even explain to you what coffee tastes like unless you have tasted it. And you are expecting a great teacher to tell you what enlightenment, whatever that is, and I will not seek to try and explain it, can be explained to you. And this is something that in today's times, the seeking of being a traveler on the path, that is the greatest challenge. That we are trained to look at tangible, concrete outcomes. So that has led to a dilution of the method.
Right.
So that you get outcomes, and which we believe are sort of more anesthetics. So where you feel calm, you feel relaxed, you de-stress, for the only purpose and reason that you can do more of what is causing it in the first place. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yes, of course. Of course. So, we've been talking about the Dalai Lama. I recently read a very interesting story about him. This was by the Dr. Larry Brilliant. When he was, he was a devotee of Neem Karoli Baba, and he was working on the smallpox eradication program for the World Health Organization. So his wife Girija and they were traveling around India, and small villages where they would go to see what's happening. So in one such village, they stayed, or in a forest, they had stayed in an awful guest house. So they hadn't had a bath and all of that, and they were just yearning for a bed to sleep on. So then somebody tells them there's a government guest house somewhere down the road. They reach at night, and apparently there was a stringent hierarchy. So if there wasn't anyone more important than you, then you could get a room. So they get a room and they take a bath, and they are sitting there. They're thinking, we won the lottery. Then one of the sort of staff members working there rush in and say, you have to go. They say, why? I said, a very big VIP is coming. You have to go. They were like, where do we go? We're not going anywhere. And who walks in? The Dalai Lama. It's still the 70s. He's young. And he immediately divines what the situation is, that these two people are about to be evicted. So he just says, sit. And he talks to them, and Brilliant has written about it quite brilliantly. And of course, Brilliant was busy with the vaccination program. So he saw that the master himself had these marks. So he talked about it. And then at night, the Dalai Lama said, it's fine. We'll share the bed. Because, the perception was that he's a Buddhist monk, all of that. And it was an extraordinary story. And of course, there's a humorous sort of epilogue to it that Dalai Lama, that Larry Brilliant writes that the next morning he left. He writes that, it's believed that once a pickpocket met a great saint, and he only saw the saint's pocket. So here was I meeting this great saint, and I was only looking at his vaccination marks. But and this gave me the joy and the life, right? It's not separate from us. It's in every moment of the Dalai Lama's life.
But the important thing is that again, we somehow we feel that if we are awakened, enlightened, whatever word you want to use, somehow suffering will disappear or pain will disappear. and that you will not, you will be in a constant state of ecstasy or bliss. Again, these are all sort of euphemisms. And I think that we see this in Thakur, and there are a lot of parallels. I just want to flag that when His Holiness was speaking on Vivekananda's centenary, he said, look, this idea of affirming celebration of diversity, he said, I got from Ramakrishna. And of course, he does them more as much as gestures. So he will go to places of worship of different faiths. He'll go to a mosque and wear the skull cap and do what have you. And so I think that the teaching of I'll just go back a step. So when the Buddha attained enlightenment, whatever happened under the tree, and we just label it enlightenment for want of a description, and he came out, he was confused. He didn't know what to do because it was a non-conceptual experience. But and also when the Buddha was dying, and people said, were mourning his passage and saying, now where will be the source of our dharma? And he said, well, whatever I have taught has sometimes been contradictory because it has been positioned for different people and their degrees of interest and learning. And it must stand up to the scrutiny of reason, logic, and experience. That's where the science comes in Swami Vivekananda. And so when we try and explain what enlightenment may be, without the actual felt experience of it being translatable, it is an insight into the true nature of reality. Whatever that reality is, or its many layers and dimensions. And so what the Buddha sought to explain was that suffering, and actually he used dukkha, which is more unsatisfactoriness rather than suffering per se, is a part of the human condition. And we will all experience some form of pain and suffering, and it's reasonable. I mean, when my mother was dying, I went to see His Holiness and I was crying. It was the first death in the family. And so he shed a few tears. And he said, go out and meditate on death. Because that is the nature of reality. So the challenge for us is that because reality is so, to our reflex response, unpleasant. We don't want to confront and see reality as it is. And so when it strikes us, or we confront it or experience it, our equilibrium is lost. So, to go back to why the Dalai Lama experiences or manifests and transmits joy, it doesn't mean that he doesn't feel pain or he doesn't feel suffering. One way we describe it is to say that he suffers, but he doesn't experience the suffering of suffering. So, and again, when we look, for me, it's fascinating often to go back and forth between Thakur and the Buddhist ideas, is that, don't forget that when Thakur was dying of cancer, he was experiencing pain. And Christ on the cross was experiencing pain. And they both had the capacity to reach out to the divine for that pain to be brought to closure or to end. The idea came up for them, but they pulled back. Because it's part of their evolution and journey, the experience of the suffering of suffering, till you got the realization that that was the true nature of reality, was crucial. Because if that process had been short-circuited by the divine, or whatever you wish to, I mean, we don't want to get into a discussion on what is divinity, but whatever that may be, that your evolution would not be complete. So the Dalai Lama sees reality as it is. Of course, he denies that he is a bodhisattva, or and he just says that, I'm a simple Buddhist monk. But we who look up to him as a teacher do believe that he is one. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. One quick question, and then we'll hear from our audience. You began with the words frazzled, fragmented, that Swami Bodhananda told you. And that's something that all of us day to day we deal with. I particularly, I'm very frazzled. I'm asking for a magic mantra now that, what is this one thing to do that will...
I have no idea. If I did, I still feel frazzled and I still feel fragmented. And if I had that magic mantra, I would call upon it right now. But generally speaking, that are very important from all traditions. There are two aspects, I think, there must be a zillion, but two come up for me right now, is the enormous value of training the mind. And the mind, like the body, needs and can be, not just the body, but different facets of the mind can be trained. And it always, it's at my very mundane level as a practitioner, what I do, I have to say that I do dedicate myself to trying to train the mind. I'm not saying I train the mind.
Right.
And is that I spend a significant part of the day, by my standards, in trying to do that. And it occurred to me after my collapse, as it were, that we spent so much time in training ourselves. At that time, it was to be a theater director, or to be a scientist, or to look beautiful, or to look handsome, or for our professions, or for the sporting skills we want to have. If you're rich and can afford to play golf, your golf swing, or whatever else it is. We invest so much time in those elements of it, or to be able to write well, but we don't consider training the mind to be a priority at all. And I think that, in the current political dispensation, we're constantly talking about India's civilizational heritage. And today, His Holiness has made this one of his passions, is to see how we can bring back in a contemporary vocabulary, and I'll tell you what we mean by contemporary vocabulary, India's traditional methods of training the mind. And what we mean by contemporary vocabulary is that when you draw on the Buddhist tradition, here's a man who says, don't take my word as final, subject it to reason and logic. And hence, over the centuries, Buddhism it's no longer Buddhism in the sense as it was at the time of the Buddha. It has continued to evolve by subsequent generations of practitioners and who came under the larger ambit of Buddhism, whose treatises and writings we treat as texts today.
Right.
And so the vocabulary of Buddhism is very easily put aside in order to look at the method. The other day, for example, and I'm going to take 2 minutes to talk about this, even though it's not a question, because it's seminal to the Dalai Lama and the aspiration. And so we did a meditation 3-4 days ago on compassion and the nurturing and cultivation of compassion, how to train your mind to be compassionate. And why compassion? Not because it will earn you brownie points in heaven, but because we know from traditional psychology and modern psychology that people who suffer or experience intense suffering, and certainly suffering of the mind, or even experience the suffering of the body beyond reasonable context, are obsessed with the I, me, mine.
Right.
And in some ways, the human predicament is the obsession with I, me, mine. And so if you cultivate and nurture the practice of compassion, the sense of the self that suffers softens. And the minute you begin to think of somebody else, your own experience of suffering, not the fact of suffering, diminishes.
Right.
And so what the method really is, and the prerequisite for the method in a sense, and this is where fragmentation comes in, is that you have to have the ability, using whatever methodology, whether it is breathing or yoga, there are many methods available in our traditions, to be able to concentrate the mind. Now you can concentrate the mind when you want to get your lipstick right, and your hand doesn't shake when you're putting on your eyelashes. Now that's a form of concentration. And but if we can extend that commitment to concentration to training our minds, because without that concentration as a prerequisite, that's where listening to music comes in. If you can't focus on anything, focus on music as a method of focusing the mind, and then build on it. Of course, yoga and the other traditions have many different methods of enhancing the ability to focus and concentrate the mind. Now, that ability to train the mind to concentrate is universally valuable. And some of the Indian art traditions will tell you just the fact of concentration, of being able to sort of take away the fragmentation of your mind, will bring you some calm and composure.
Compassion and concentration. The two things. Should we take some questions from the audience? Well, okay. There is a lady there. Yes, please. Then we'll come back up front.
Hi. I know you said diets are individualistic, but could you share a little bit about your diet? And I'll pass.
You mean my mental diet, my physical diet? I don't want to. Yes, of course. My physical diet, I don't want to talk about. The results are obvious. Yeah. Yes, sir. You have a related question?
Sort of.
Yes, please.
So I was in the session which Ani Oberoi took on the foundation.
Yes, of course. Yes.
My question, sir, is about children and sometimes the brutal adverse childhood experiences that they undergo, and the difference between knowing and feeling, the thesis that you alluded to in terms of when, and particularly about insight, and the younger the child that we are working with. And we have been working on the transformation of some of the stuff that we have articulated in the manner that it applies to very young children, particularly preschoolers. So when we speak about predicaments of the mind, that I would like to hear your thoughts about how the kind of journey that you undertaken, how that applies to children who experience and endure mental predicament.
I'll have to be honest and say, as far as about children, I know very little. I mean, I could sort of hypothesize, but I don't honestly have the experience. And I think our friend Hani Oberoi is really the best person. However, I can sort of talk about some general principles which will apply to everybody, including children who are traumatized or who are struggling. And some of these, I'll just answer your question about my mental diet. And my mental diet, I'm afraid, is because I'm still I'm a struggling. I describe myself as a struggling sadhaka. I've promoted myself from student to sadhaka, and so it's like my physical diet. Sometimes it's a hot hodgepodge, and we do receive once you formally become a student of a master, you get a transmission. Like from Swami Ranganathan, I got a diksha, which was a particular mantra that you keep, repeating to yourself. I don't know if this is the context or space to talk about mantras and get into that kind of discussion. But so what the teacher does is he prescribes a mental diet that he considers appropriate for you. And that mental diet has many elements. And so the basis of meditation, as we see it, is, we say vipassana, shamatha, mindfulness. These are all phrases which have gained very popular currency. There's nothing wrong with them, except that we believe that they are sort of anesthetics that prepare the mind to be able to go the next stage. Because without content that impacts the mind, realization will not happen. Now, let me just dwell on the process, if I may, a little bit. And, we use the word mind very loosely. And, the series you're talking about, and I recommend it to anybody who wants to watch, is called Healing Our Minds. multi-faith, multidisciplinary approaches. How does Islam look at it? How does Christianity look at it? How do different traditions look at healing our minds? But what is the mind? And this will obviously have to be, there are sort of long treatises written on the nature of the mind. But essentially, the mind is what mediates the brain, which processes sensory experience and translates them into sensations, feelings, or what have you. And the mind, which mediates the space between the brain and consciousness as an awareness. This is sort of roughly put. Of course, in Hinduism, we don't have consciousness in the way we understand it in Buddhism. Consciousness is actually, it's called the Atman, it's the soul.
Right.
But common to these three elements, something that we can understand in terms of the modern dynamic and modern understanding. I don't know who to look at. I'll look at you. That's easier. Is that, every thought that we have or every experience creates an imprint in our consciousness, in our brain, at the level of both biochemistry and psychologically in the mind. And so each subsequent action or response or feeling is because of what has been imprinted in our minds, predisposes us to a certain response. It's like, if we eat acidic food, you'll feel acidity, and that will be your response to it. So just imagine an accumulation of all these imprints of every, and this is an important distinction that we draw on our tradition, that when we talk about karma, what is karma? Karma is the imprint on our consciousness, but it is not the imprint of our actions, as is commonly spoken about, but of our intention.
Right.
So it is the intention behind an action, the motivation, that creates the imprint. So if I have to tell a lie to a group of people looking for someone of another faith who I am hiding and saying I have no one here, the intent to have told a lie, the intention is larger than myself. So the imprint on my consciousness will be a positive one.
Right.
So, and again, the positive and negative is not our gradations. So what a mental diet is doing really in meditation is through what we call analytical meditation, we consciously plant imprints in our consciousness that will predispose us to what happens in the future. So example, if we want to nurture compassion, and this is part of what we did in our practice the other day, we visualize and we feel, for example, in our communities, mother's love, or the love of a partner, or your pet.
Right.
And the emotion it creates in us, and then we juxtapose the person we love with someone neutral, and then the enemy. So we can for at least for a moment feel the same feeling of compassion that softens the self and imprint that on our consciousness. So there are many analytical meditations that enable us to think through processes, arrive at conclusions that will imprint our consciousness. So Punita will be happy to know. So one of the meditations we did that day was of gratitude to acknowledge that we were here at the Jaipur Literary Festival and to recognize interdependence to the number of people whose contribution made this possible. Not just that. So to go back to my favorite analogy of coffee, even the coffee we were drinking, to acknowledge the person who brewed the coffee, who planted the coffee, who brewed it, who brought it here for us. Now, if we keep repeating these calibrated thought processes, the idea that my happiness, my existence depends on each one of you here will automatically change my relationship with you. So this is how we try and impact the reflex response.
Right.
And to the other question about children, and this is one of the sort of more challenging areas because in our traditions in the East, we take reincarnation for granted. And we are able to work with the assumption of reincarnation. Whereas if we were to take this matrix out into the West, it usually becomes a problem. because it needs to be argued, it needs to be explained. And while it can be, it's a convoluted argument which I only partially understand. We will not dare to go into that here. But then what, in reincarnation too, there is a difference in the way Buddhists look at it and the Hindu traditions look at it, except to some degree in the non-duality school, is that we don't believe in a single soul, a single strand of continuity of the soul. So those of you who have read Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, seen the movie, and if you haven't, I recommend it. It's an old movie by, again, Punita will know, the husband of a very dear friend of ours who made that film, Conrad Rooks. And so he uses the analogy of the river. And so the river is continuity, and yet there isn't a single strand in it. It's ever changing, but it's the same river.
Right.
And it carries the hallmarks of what happens upstream, downstream.
Right.
So downstream is our present existence. So in the case of children, there are two matrix that operate. Obviously, there is the carry forward of what happened in their last lives and imprints that they are carrying into this life, which can be antidoted. We also have this wonderful notion of antidotes. Can be antidoted by parenting, by care, and by the manner in which we can try and impact the mental diet that they process. I mean, it cannot be sort of complete and definitive. That's been a long answer. We're out of time.
We're out of time, but I think we'll take one more question.
Can I just ask one? Sorry, Rajiv. This is about your personal journey. How did you resolve the external contradictions between you spoke about methodology. So Thakur's completely, sublime surrender to the Ma, to Kali, Dakshineshwar, all that, and the rational and scientific thing that the Dalai Lama propagates. How did you resolve those? I mean, they seem contradictory.
Well, that's the whole, how to put it, that's the whole point in a sense, that they appear contradictory. And if you just look at Vivekananda sort of articulated it so beautifully, and he said that each one of us, I mean, he of course categorized it so it would be accessible. So he said Karma Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Raja Yoga, Jnana Yoga. So, and nobody really follows an absolute archetype. And in the same way that you learn from all of them. So if you have 2 minutes, it's interesting.
Yes, please.
Because the aspect of bhakti. And is that in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, as in the Hindu tradition, we have deities. But there is a difference between how we in Buddhism look at the deity and how Hinduism looks at the deity. But what is common to both of them? Why do we have a zillion deities? Can anybody tell me why we have so many deities? Yes.
Because we have so many people?
Okay. It's that, but I got it. It's what you're saying is that everything is interconnected.
And equally reverential.
But it's much more nuanced and specific than that. And why do we have 1,000 forms of Lord Ganesh itself? And how does that happen? That happens because through millennia, teachers evolved archetypical images that would serve as our mental diet, and then began to tweak them. So at a very gross level, His Holiness felt that, say, I was very shy and reticent. So he urged that I practice with a wrathful deity, so that the qualities of the deity would create imprints in my consciousness. So every deity is tweaked by a master. So someone will give you a trishul, and in another deity, the trishul is taken away. And when a master is designing, in a sense, or modifying a deity for you, a curriculum, well put, she's a teacher, the deity will be tweaked to meet your particular psychosomatic needs. And even at the gross level, we know that particular colors have a psychological impact. So, for example, I am working with a deity that is red, because it's to energize me and give me courage. And for the same reason, you have a red light. Now, somebody who's very wrathful and needs to calm down may get blue or white, or depending what it is. and every element in it. It's not just an abstract symbol. And that is, whether it's Eric Fromm's sort of, the universal consciousness, what are they? What are those symbols? Those symbols represent particular mind states. So the use of deities is hereby reversed.
Right, right.
But the significant difference is that in our tradition, again, saying to make it, not consciously to make it, but makes it more accessible, is that we create the deity as we meditate. So, from out of shunya, and that's another discussion for another day. Shunya is not emptiness, shunya is not nothingness. I will not try and explain it because I only partially understand it myself. But so you create the deity from your mind's projection, you work with it, and then you dissolve it. Whereas in Hinduism, we believe that the deity, for all practical purposes, actually exists.
Right.
But we still pray to the deity, we still supplicate to the deity, but the deity is the creation of our minds. And our relationship to the deity is arising.
Okay, I'm going to now make you answer this one question because somebody's won something, partner.
Okay.
We've got partner content winners, and the prize was that you would answer their question, Rajiv. So you
What?
have, yes. So you have to now answer this question. All right. Okay. Well, yes. So this is from Ashish Sharma, and he asks that today, when life is so hectic, there are so many things that keep running in our minds. But beneath that, there are these, depths of illusions. How do you balance? That's the question. I'm not making it up.
Goodness, we have delusions beneath all. Well, we are deluded because we don't see the true nature of reality. And in order to see the true nature of reality, we have to engage with what we call in Buddhist terms, Sutra and Tantra. And Tantra is not just sexuality. Tantra is method, and Sutra is wisdom. And so wisdom will tell you, as I was illustrating, that we are all interdependent. Now, Tantra, which is the practice, which I talked about, exchanging oneself with others, will help you realize it so you see and experience that reality.
Right.
And unless we work at both these levels, we can talk till doomsday about what is and what shouldn't be. And that is one of the reasons why, as a species, we're not able to respond to what's happening with climate change, because we're talking about it and we're not yet pausing to actually experience the impact of climate change.
And the transformation hasn't happened. Our reflexes are still the same. Right. Okay. I think we're very much out of time. So I want to really thank our audience. We've had a wonderful audience. It's a hot afternoon. So thank you so much for being here so present, so mindful, and thank you, Rajiv.
And thank you for being so indulgent.
Thank you, Rajiv and Devapriya, for a very engaging conversation, which I think has brought a lot of wisdom to the JLF this season. And I think, except for answering your original question, we stand wiser for everything, which is what is enlightenment. But I think that's a quest that we will continue with. We also thank Rajasthan Patrika for support in this session. Thank you very much. It was a privilege to have both of you talking. Rajiv will be signing his books, right? And Devapriya.